There is an idea among some that a team season is only successful if they achieve the ultimate. This is patently absurd. If this were true, then the vast majority of sports matches that get played every year just don't matter. A tennis Grand Slam would have 120 meaningless matches, for example. Now, obviously, if you are a rebuilding team or a young player well down the rankings, we rightly don't hold you to the same standard as better teams and players. But if you're in the window and failed to win the big game at the end, well, that was a waste of time. What I want to demonstrate is you don't have to win it all to have an impact. In this video, I'm discussing one of those figures, the coaching career of John Northey. I like watching classic footy matches from before I was born. I hope you do too. They were often so brilliant, and I remember watching in early 2023 the 1995 semi-final at the MCG where Richmond beat Essendon and that iconic Northey celebration that followed. That was a remarkable win. Essendon in the 90s were a great footy team, led by one of the greatest coaches ever in Kevin Sheedy. Furthermore, Richmond in the 90s aren't thought of in the same postcode as Essendon in that decade. So how on earth did Richmond and Northey pull it off? Come to think of it, how on earth did he drag Melbourne, who hadn't played finals in 2 decades, to a grand final in 1988? How did he launch the Brisbane Bears, a club which was an afterthought and a dodgy experiment, to a prelim in 1996? The clubs he coached at would all go on to great success, and much of that comes down to a single man who never replicated the Premiership success he got as a player from the coach's box. This is the story of John Northey, a centrally important footy figure and perhaps the greatest coach to never win a V/AFL Premiership. Before we get to the coaching career of John Northey, which is what this video is about, it is probably only right to set the stage and discuss his background and playing career. Northey had a successful career. A Richmond Tiger all his playing days, he debuted in round 1 in 1963 against Collingwood. He was a lightly built half-forward flanker who went by the nickname Swooper, one given to him by Lou Richards. He was an opportunist who only needed a few possessions to change a game. He read the play very well, was a fine handballer, and was a dangerous snapshot for goal. He kicked his first career goal in his second game in round 8 against Essendon, and in round 18 against a Fitzroy team that won 1 game all season, he kicked a couple of majors and was involved in his first win as a VFL player. He played in at least 14 matches for every year from 1964 until 1970. Between 1965 and 1968, as a matter of fact, he played 64 consecutive seniors games. His highest individual goal tally in a game was the 8 he kicked in round 9, 1968 against Melbourne. Through his career, he kicked 5 or more goals 6 times. He kicked a career total of 192 goals. At the time of recording, that is the 25th most of any Richmond player. He was a dual Premiership player involved in the Tigers flags of 1967 and 1969. He was awarded Richmond Live membership in 1970, the year he left a club, a decision he later regretted. He then moved to Western Suburbs in New South Wales as a playing coach. He led that club to the 1972 Premiership as well as coaching the state team, something Northey reflected on as being one of the highlights of his coaching career, when the New South Wales team beat the second VFL side. Whilst coaching Western Suburbs, they kicked 51 goals during 1 game in 1972. He then moved to Redden as playing coach in 1974. He led that club to 3 consecutive premierships in 1975, 76, 77. This was off the back of a 23-year premiership hoodoo. He then returned to Melbourne to coach St Kilda's reserves for 3 seasons and then returned to Ballarat in 1981 and coached that league's representative sides. In total, he coached the Ballarat League to 3 country premierships. Northey's first job as a head coach in the V/AFL was up in Sydney. This was a crazy time for the Swans, who were only 3 years removed since relocating from South Melbourne to the Harbour City. The list of Sydney coaches was quite volatile. Is this normal for footy of the era? After researching the history of the team I support, I can't say it was for Geelong. No coach since Norm Smith from 1969 to 1972 had coached the Swans for 4 consecutive seasons. Ian Stewart coached the side for 5 years, but that included 2 stints with Des Tudman squeezed between him for 1978. Ricky Quaid had a 57-match run, and after Tony Franklin for 1 game and Bob Hammond for 8, got the Swans to the end of 1984, Northey was in. He would only last one season in New South Wales. Sydney finished 10th of 12, winning just 6 matches. It was pretty clear that Northey was not in the vision that Sydney's owner, Jeffrey Edelston, had for the club. Northey was picked up by Melbourne ahead of 1986. Northey helped improve the Demons by a win from 6 wins to 7, which would have been a bit disappointing given they'd actually started the season 2-0. 1987 was a big year for Melbourne. It had been 22 years since the club unleashed the curse of Norm Smith, after the club sacked a man whose fingerprints were over 10 of the club's then 12 Premiership Cups, as either a player and more famously as a coach. Not only had the Demons not won a Premiership since the shocking sacking of Smith, which stunned the footy world, they hadn't even made the finals since. Melbourne switched back from a lighter shade of blue, which they had been wearing since the first full season where games were broadcast in colour, to a more traditional, iconic, darker blue. The switch of jumpers came with the Demons' first piece of silverware since the 1964 flag, when they won the 1987 National Panasonic Cup. Robert Flower had talked himself out of retirement so as to have one last crack at playing finals footy. Melbourne, for much of the season, failed to win 3 games in a row, and only won 2 games in a row on one occasion. After a loss to St Kilda on July the 18th, hope looked lost for Melbourne. They won their next 2, but at the end of round 18 of 22, they were still 2 wins outside the 5th placed Footscray. But 2 wins in a row became 4 with victories over Collingwood and West Coast, setting up a blockbuster final round. The final game of the round was a famous one for D supporters. Melbourne played Footscray at the Whitten Oval. Whoever won made finals as long as the Cats lost to Hawthorn. The two sides were never more than a couple goals apart, but at three-quarter time it looked as if the Cats were going to triumph. Wary of a last quarter fade-out, Northey and the rest of the coaching staff told the players that Hawthorn were winning. In fact, the Cats looked good for their lead, and with the game at the Western Oval ending earlier, the entire ground glued their ears to their radios. Melbourne got up over Footscray, and then they heard the Hawks had got over the line by 3 points. For just the 3rd time all year, the others being after round 1 and round 7, Melbourne was sitting inside the 5. It was after the only round that matters for these things, the last one. Flower's dreams of finals footy had finally come true. More than 72,000 showed up for the elimination final against North Melbourne, and any suggestion that the Demons had played their grand final in the preceding weeks was destroyed when Melbourne kicked 19 goals to 2 after quarter time to slaughter North by 118 points. The next week they came up against a rapidly disintegrating Sydney side who'd finished 3rd but lost their first final to Hawthorn by 99 points. Against an opposition playing like men possessed, they were never going to stand a chance, and Melbourne duly saluted by 76 points in front of more than 80,000. The next match was played at VFL Park, and those Hawks, which got Melbourne into the finals, now faced them in a famous prelim. Against a team with years of finals experience, John Northey tried to motivate his squad by allowing fans to visit the ruins before the game. On field, his big tactical move was to play Rod Grinter in attack. Melbourne kicked with the wind in the first quarter, but only turned their advantage into a 5-point lead. Then the wind swung around again, giving them a second chance. They stretched the lead to over 3 goals during the term, but lost Robert Flower after a bump from Robert Dipper Domenico. He was forced to leave the ground with a damaged shoulder. By half-time, the lead was 22 points, and when the sides broke even in the 3rd quarter, it left Melbourne with a handy lead in kicking with the wind. After a failed move to fall forward, Dermot Brereton was thrown into defence, where he helped turn the tide for his team. Both Ricky Johnson and Brian Wilson left the ground injured, and Hawthorn got to within 9 points. Melbourne then missed multiple chances to seal the match. Simon Eishold, firstly, with one of the worst misses in history. Ricky Jackson set up Graham Yates 30 metres out from goal and then watched him miss. Initially, Hawthorn missed chances to take advantage of their own, but drew within a goal with 30 seconds left when Gary Buckenara goals from the square. From the ensuing bounce, Tony Campbell missed a shot at goal with seconds left after Greg Healy had pounced on one at the centre clearance. Melbourne only had 6 behinds in the last quarter, but there were only seconds left. Hawthorn went for broke.
28 and a half minutes have gone. Alan Jeans has a close look at the situation. The long kick taken by Swab, plays on. Langford comes out with the ball, drives it down. Buckenara trip. Buckenara's free kick. Siren sounds. There's the siren, and he's got a kick from 55 metres out. I don't think they...
It's 15 metres! 15!
Jim Stynes, the greatest Australian footballer born outside of Australia, ran through the mark, incurring a 15-metre penalty. Di-Mauro was in a similar spot to where he'd missed one earlier, but he wouldn't
His goal,
do it this
Hawthorn in the
time.
1987 grand final. If he misses, Melbourne are in. There's the kick. It's a goal! It's a goal! Hawthorn have won with a kick after the siren. What a performance! A magnificent performance this by Hawthorn. Poor old Melbourne. You've got to, the hearts go out to the Melbourne Football Club.
Despite choking in a prelim, Melbourne going from 11th to in effect 3rd in 1 year is a crazy turnaround and marks the genius of Northey to get a team to do better than what they should be doing on paper. Melbourne made a number of list changes, though not all were enforced. Robert Flower, Peter Giles, Stephen Ike, Peter Keel and Robin White retired. Adrian Battiston went to Sydney, Steve Turner to St Kilda, and Joe Rigolio joined Sandringham. Greg Healy became the club's youngest ever captain at 22 years old. After their narrow miss in the previous year's preliminary final, bookies opened the Demons at 10-1 for the flag and evens to make finals. Pre-season training took place at Ballarat, where John Northey engaged Australian marathon runner and Melbourne fan Steve Monaghetti to accompany his players on a 7.5 hill climb run. While the professional wasn't running at 100%, he was still beaten to the line by Jim Stynes in a sprint finish. Melbourne started in 1988 with 5 straight wins, and after round 7 and 8, they were sitting atop of the ladder. But a poorer back half of the year saw Melbourne slide down to 5th, the same spot where they had finished the year before. While Carlton Collingwood playing a qualifying final in front of 83,000 at the MCG felt like the more important game of the weekend, history was made the day before at VFL Park. West Coast were playing in their first final and their first game at Waverley that wasn't under the floodlights. Before the match, Northey had used Perth press clippings featuring Eagles coach John Todd, labelling his opponents as ordinary, not very skillful, and had made the finals by default as a motivational tool, and was hoping to catch a psychological advantage for his side, which had struggled in recent weeks. On a wet day, the Eagles were red hot in the first quarter, and it was only the defensive performances of Danny Hughes and Alan Johnson that allowed Melbourne to escape the first half just 22 points adrift. It could have been more had Wally Matera not missed running into an open goal, but Melbourne did get a late goal. Sean White, after a forgettable first half in defence, was thrown to full forward and responded by sparking his side with 2 early goals. 6 goals for the quarter were aptly topped off by Johnson, booting 1 from 50. The last quarter was a back and forth affair, with the lead changing hands 3 times in the last 7 minutes. At the 30-minute mark of the last quarter, with the Eagles 4 points in front, Earl Spalding missed a set shot 30 metres from goal before Gary Lyon snapped a goal less than a minute later to put the Demons back in front. Murray Renstead had the chance to win the game for the Eagles, but his kick to an open goal square in the last few minutes bounced the wrong way. Melbourne held on, and referencing the press clippings after the match, Northey said, "For ordinary players, they did a magnificent job." Melbourne played Collingwood the following week. With the preliminary final berth on offer for the winner, the match was held up for 4 minutes before the first bounce as the teams brawled, which saw Stephen Stretch knocked out. When the game started, Stephen Newport went to Peter Dacos, while Greg Healy was tagged by Tony Shaw, and the Demons skipped to an early advantage and had a 23-point lead at half-time. Mick McGuan had been one of the best Magpies, but got injured, which allowed Andy Lovell to burst into the game. Collingwood got within a goal in the third, but they could never get their noses in front. Errol Spalding was excellent, as was Gary Lyon, and Sean White went forward and provided sparks. With the game in the balance in the last term, Newport kicked a freak goal to give his side a 3-goal buffer. Brian Taylor kicked 2 late goals, but Newport returned for the sealer, a goal from 55 metres. Melbourne played Carlton in the prelim, with the heartache of 1987 still fresh in the memory bank. It was the first time the sides had met in a final since the 1962 semi-final. Northey dropped Todd Viney and Doug Coop, replacing them with David Flintoff, who had impressed against Carlton in round 13, and rookie Stephen Phoebe. Carlton, fresh off a demoralising defeat against Hawthorn on the same ground a week earlier, were missing among others key midfielder Wayne Johnston and key forward Stephen Kernahan. The Demons kicked with the wind in the first quarter and ran away to what would ultimately become a match-winning 5-goal lead. The Blues fought back in the second quarter with more disciplined football and even took a lead into half-time, but the Demons once again used the wind to perfection in the third term, where they pulled on 7-1 despite the heavens opening. The most memorable of all the goals was Gary Lyon kicking a 75-metre torpedo. Melbourne would win by 22 before playing the Hawks in the grand final. With ruckman Steve O'Dwyer suspended, Northey went with Viney as his replacement. His first tactical move was to throw Danny Hughes into the ruck. Stretch, one of Melbourne's best in the prelim, was sent to full back to play on Jason Dunstall. The plan was for Stretch to run off the Hawthorn spearhead and provide drive out of defence for the Demons. It didn't really work. While he held Dunstall to 1 goal, he couldn't get enough of the ball to do any damage. Years later, Northey suggested his team got off to a slow start, partly because they were made to wait an extra 3 minutes to run onto the ground while waiting for the pre-game entertainment to finish. The Demons kicked with the wind in the second quarter, and after getting there first, fans were hoping that would signify a revival. Instead, it sparked the Hawks into murderous form. Midway through the second, Stretch was moved on to Dipper Domenico, and the game was already rapidly sliding away. The margin was 49 points at halftime, and in wet conditions, there was no way back for the Demons. They kicked the first goal of the third quarter, but once again suffered an avalanche of goals. Hawthorn had won by 96 points. The result would remain the biggest win in the grand final until Geelong's 119-point win over Port Adelaide in 2007. From a certain point of view, the next few years were good, if not better, for Melbourne when compared to 1988. In 1989, Melbourne won 14 games. The last time they did that was in 1964, back when the VFL had an 18-game season. The Demons finished 4th, a spot higher on the ladder than where Melbourne had finished in the previous 2 seasons. Melbourne got the better of Collingwood in the elimination final, but fell the following week to eventual grand finalist Geelong. In 1990, Melbourne improved to 16 wins, and yet they still finished 4th. In the elimination final of the MCG against Hawthorn, the first goal took 14 minutes, and the sides engaged in a tight defensive battle. Hawthorn led at half-time, but they could have had a far greater margin if they kicked straight. It took until the 18-minute mark of the third term for Melbourne to hit the lead for the first time, when an errant Chris Langford kick-in landed in the arms of Ricky Jackson, who converted. 2 minutes later, Darren Bennett kicked a goal from a free kick, and with 2 goals in time on, the Demons went into the last with a 4-goal lead. The Hawks charged in the last term and got to 9 points behind as time on began, but their tilt was snuffed out when Greg Healy took a courageous mark running back with the flight. This ended a 7-year run of the Hawks making the grand final. A more famous game that weekend was Collingwood and West Coast, who played a draw at Waverley, and despite having an extra week rest, Melbourne would lose in a semi-final to the Eagles by 30 points. Melbourne only managed 13 wins in 1991, but that was enough to make finals, especially given the finals had expanded to 6 starting that year. For that year, probably because finals creator Ken McIntyre was trying to be a bit too clever and too mathematical with his system, 3rd would play 4th and 5th would play 6th in do-or-die elimination finals. As a result, instead of playing St Kilda like they would have if this was 1992 or 1993, Melbourne played the comparatively easier Eston and beat them before losing to West Coast. In 1992, Melbourne regressed to just 7 wins and 1 draw, finishing 11th, and Northey elected to leave Melbourne. Swooper went back to Richmond and took over as head coach of the side for 1993. The first 2 seasons were disappointments as the Tigers failed to make finals. In 1993, Richmond won just 4 games that season, the worst season for Richmond since 1982, but they were a team posting a lot of poor seasons after that grand final defeat. But in true Northey fashion, Richmond improved quickly to 12 wins in 1994, finishing just outside finals. The rise continued in 1995. Richmond won their first 5 matches of the season and ended June with a record of 12-1. However, there was a slide in the back part of the year, and the Tigers finished the season having won 15 games and drawing 1, resulting in a 3rd place finish. The last 9 games of the season for the Tigers saw them win thrice, 1 draw and 5 losses. On a Friday night in a qualifying final against North Melbourne, the game was nip and tuck through the first 3 quarters, and North led by just 9 points at the last change, but the Kangaroos kicked 6 goals to 3 in the last term and secured a 30-point win. Richmond having finished third, were basically guaranteed a double chance as long as Carlton and Geelong, who finished first and second, respectively, both won, which they did. Richmond would have to play Essendon in a semi-final the following week at the MCG. That one draw that Richmond had earlier in the season was against the Bombers. Richmond trailed by 5 goals at half-time and was being beaten in almost every position on the field. However, one Tiger was doing everything in his power to keep a pulse. Matthew Knight, Richmond's acting captain, had produced a brilliant solo exhibition throughout the first half, kicking 3 of the side's 4 goals, including a magnificent 5-bounce effort. Knight had almost single-handedly provided the spark for a change of form in the second half. Northey made several position changes at half-time. Key defender Scott Turner was moved forward. Key forward Brendan Gale went back. Nick Duffy and Stuart Maxfield went into the midfield, while Naish subsequently went to the wing early in the third term when Michael Gale was injured. The first half of the third quarter was an arm wrestle, with neither team being able to goal until Duffy received a holding free kick. Duffy's kick from about 25 metres out sailed through for the Tigers' first goal since the 3rd-minute mark of the second term. The Richmond comeback was on. Richmond were all of a sudden energised, with Turner goaling shortly after off a snap. In a chaotic passage of play which saw plenty of fumbles, Knight's composure was again so crucial, and Naish, after receiving a hand pass, responded by bursting inside 50, taking a bounce and kicking a goal.
Hip and shoulder's okay. It goes forward. Naish is a great finisher. He surely will kick the goal. He has! They're back!
From the next centre bounce, Naish hacked the ball off the ground, finding Turner, who gave it to Duffy, who goaled from 55 to bring the margin down to 6 points. Essendon were becoming ill-disciplined, shown when James Hird gave away a free kick after the ball was well out of bounds. Then, just before the siren, Naish kicked another goal from a superb snap, which meant the Tigers were somehow in front by 1 point. Northey's genius and trust had paid off after a 5-goal-to-none burst of a third term. The momentum was all Richmond's, and despite being inaccurate in the last quarter, kicking 3-7, the damage from the third quarter was enough. Essendon only kicked 2 goals after half-time, and Richmond would win by 13 points.
Saw John Northey waving the jacket.
Northey's celebration was very much a homage to Kevin Sheedy's jacket wave when Essendon beat West Coast in 1993. It was something Northey promised the players he would do before the match.
Promised the players on Thursday night, after we won the game, as soon as I stepped out of the box, I would do the wave for them. And I tell you what, it's one of the most thrilling things I've ever done.
In the preliminary final the following week, Richmond was no match for the Cats. The match was over by half-time when the Cats kicked 13-3. The Cats won by 89 points. In normal circumstances, this would not have been Northey's last game as the Tigers coach, and yet it was.
As moments later, Northey announced his resignation.
This morning I went in and had a brief discussion with the General Manager, Jim Malone, and after that I just resigned.
Northey was hoping to extend his contract, which was due to expire at the end of '96, for another 12 months.
I dare say when you get into the situation I'm in, you need a bit of security like players do, and really that's what I was looking for, but the club weren't prepared to budge on the contract that I have at this stage.
After coaching the Tigers for the past 3 years, Northey had built up a strong bond with the players.
I respect the boys. I love them all, I can tell you that, because you just don't do the things we've done out in the ground by having great respect and certainly having that great spirit we had out on the ground. You know, it's I must say, that's the part that really hurts me, that, you know, I suppose I'm giving up that chance. I talk about loyalty all the time, and, you know, which is really annoys me, I dare say.
Northey met with Brisbane over the weekend and recognises the potential in the club.
You know, it's difficult when you've got to go into a club and get to know everybody again. That's the difficult part, but at least they've got some obviously very, very good young talented players there, and they had a very good year last year. So, you know, hopefully we can improve on what they've done in the past, as I'm sure Richmond will do.
And it's not $1 million.
No, it would have been up there yesterday if it had been $1 million.
Richmond then held a press conference late this afternoon and hit back angrily at Northey, claiming he was the one who walked out on the club and he's only looking out for himself.
He's now poking around the media looking for sympathy, and he won't cop any from me because he walked out on us, but the club is not at fault here. John Northey is at fault. John Northey broke his contract. He has walked out on the Richmond Football Club, and he can say that he had tears in his eyes today, and he can say that the players had tears in their eyes, but he has walked out on us.
Northey, quite rightly, wanted a little bit more security on his contract. It was due to expire in 1996, and he wanted to extend that contract to 1997. Richmond refused to do so, and so he left. And while Richmond president Leon Daffin was quite right that Northey had walked, the coach that had just led them to a prelim wasn't in the wrong. He was quite right to want a bit more security and had earned it. I thought Daffin was poor in that press conference, in the way he spoke about a legend of the club and a coach who had turned the team's fate around in 24 months. In retrospect, the refusal to give Northey an extra year was a terrible decision and probably set the Tigers back some 15 years. Between 1996 and 2016, Richmond won exactly one final. So, Northey went to his fourth club as a coach, the Brisbane Bears, as the two sides swapped coaches, with Brisbane's 1995 coach Robert Walls taking over as Richmond's coach for the AFL centenary season. The Brisbane Bears were in their 10th season of existence, and they looked to be on the up, very much the opposite of Fitzroy, who were given the ultimatum of merge or collapse. Such a sad fate for a founding club of a league that was celebrating their 100th season. The Bears seniors team played in their first final in 1995, a 13-point loss to Carlton. The Northey-led Brisbane won their first two matches in 1996, but lost to Richmond in round 3. After a draw to Geelong in round 10, Brisbane were 8-1-1 and sitting third on the ladder. The back half of the season was strong, winning 7 straight games from round 15 to round 21, which included a win at Princes Park over Fitzroy by 87 points, after the Bears swooped in and agreed to merge with Fitzroy after talks with North Melbourne stalled. Brisbane's 7-game winning streak meant the Bears were sitting first on the ladder, level on points with Sydney, but 7.7% ahead with 1 weekend to go. But a 49-point loss to the 11th place Collingwood at Victoria Park saw the Bears drop to third, below Sydney and North Melbourne. As a result, they would play the 6th place Essendon in the first week of the finals. After a 10-year and 220-game wait, Brisbane would finally play a home final. They welcomed the Bombers to the Gabba on a Friday night. It was a milestone night, with Marcus Ashcroft and Alistair Lynch playing their 150th game, and for Sean Hart, it was his 100th. At quarter time, the Bears led by 17 points, but kicked 4-6, so it should have been more. Essendon kicked 6-2 in the second quarter and led by kick at half-time. The lead changed 7 times through the first 3 terms, but with 1 quarter left, the Bears had a 10-point lead. Essendon coach Kevin Sheedy moved Dustin Fletcher, playing in his 73rd game, forward and kicked a couple of goals, but the best on the field was a different Fletcher. Adrian Fletcher for the Bears had 31 possessions and was crucial. Dustin's couple of majors, though, had 4 goals to the Bears between them, and a great goal from Alistair Lynch, which was his 4th for the evening, gave the Bears a 26-point lead. But Essendon began to work their way back into the match. Gavin Wanganeen was a big part of that, as was Fletcher's shepherding, and with 7 minutes left, Essendon were only 4 points adrift. The game tightened and the scoring became difficult. With 2 minutes left, it was a 2-point game. Brisbane were keeping possession in their forward half, but finally Essendon got it forward. Then Matthew Lloyd, playing in his 14th game, marked and kicked long to the square. Could Brisbane hold on?
This is Matthew Lloyd. Cover yourself in glory, son. He kicks to the square. They get back. No mark. Wanganeen! He's hit the post. It's a point to difference. And we've got 17 seconds left. This is the most unbelievable climax to a game of footy we've seen for many, many years. Many, many years.
No extra time, remember. There can be no draw here. I mean, there will be extra time. There can be no draw. So a point the margin. Clark the target. Did he mark it? No, it's out of play.
15-11 to 15-10. Remember, if the Bombers lose and either Geelong or Hawthorn are successful, they're out of the finals. Barnard pushes forward. Hart, the Bears have won!
Northey had done it again. He had outcoached Sheedy in a final for the second straight year. Essendon would get a double chance and even a home final the following week against West Coast because of a deal the Melbourne Cricket Club and the AFL had at the time that there had to be one final per week played at the MCG. The Bombers beat the Eagles before losing to Sydney in the prelim by a point. The 1996 Bombers are the only side to lose two finals in the same year by 1 point. Anyway, Brisbane would have to shape up the following week where they thrashed a Carlton team who was coming off a 55-point drubbing from West Coast in Perth by 97 points. After that victory at the Gabba, they went to play in their only preliminary final, did the Brisbane Bears. Despite a valiant fight against North Melbourne, the Bears were left to rue a second quarter where they kicked 4 behinds to North's 4 goals. They lost by 39 points. Northey would coach the newly merged Brisbane Lions in 1997. He wouldn't last long. 1997 saw Brisbane finish 8th and lose to eventual grand finalists St Kilda in the first week of the finals. The first half of 1998 was a disaster. They only won 2 of their first 10 games. Then, after a humiliating 71-point defeat to Fremantle in round 11, Northey was shown the door. So, that is the story of John Northey's coaching career. He coached in 315 games, the third most for someone who never won a flag, behind Rodney Eade and Ken Hinkley. He had a 50.48 winning percentage, which is nothing to write home about, but he was super impactful for 3 different teams. He got Melbourne to their first final and then grand final in not quite 2.5 decades, and then made 3 further finals appearances. He got Richmond to the finals for the first time in 13 years, eventually making a prelim. Then he got the Bears as far as they would ever go in their 10-year pre-merger history. He took over 3 teams who were not in ideal circumstances and took them deep into September. His resume is very much a byproduct of the 80s and 90s era. At Melbourne, he quickly took a lowly team and took them up the ladder. Under Northey, Melbourne reached 5 straight final series, which included a grand final in 1988. In today's world, where the AFL is an outlier among world sports as to how long clubs hold on to coaches, he would likely have coached the Demons for at least 5 years longer than he did. Or to put it another way, if Damien Hardwick was coaching in the 90s and had the same resume as he did in our timeline circa 2016, he would not have coached Richmond in 2017. Northey never had the best list of players, but he often got the very best he could out of his team. If a handful of things had gone differently, Jim Stynes didn't run through the mark, he got an extension at Richmond, or the Bears didn't lose to Collingwood in the last round of the 1996 home and away season, which saw them drop from a potential minor premiership down to 3rd on the ladder, he might have won a premiership as a coach, like he did as a player. Swooper is a fascinating footy figure. Even now, more than 4 decades on from when his V/AFL coaching career began, he's always popping up in the footy archives, more likely than not ready to turn a game on its head. An excellent player, a superb coach, and arguably the best coach to never win a V/AFL Premiership.